Hello everyone, welcome to EDFGC 5806. This week we're looking at testing standards and regulatory regimes in a global and national exemplar context. The intention is that you understand the use of standardised testing at global and national level and reflect critically about debates in respect to comparisons, national testing in Australia and the implication for schools. And you should be able to give two examples of how standardised assessment influenced teachers' work in Australia by the end of this. So why do we assess? Well, a key purpose really is to try to lift and establish standards of learning. And this is not just in Australia, it's pretty much a universal belief that we need assessment to raise the standards in response to the challenges of globalisation. And by that I mean all those comparisons of how students are travelling and achieving in various countries. And that's obviously a connection to what we're going to talk about shortly, OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. But we do see this very much in the local context as well. The whole idea of better schools, National Plan for School Improvement, we're actually surrounded by a discourse of trying to raise standards and improve it. So it's something that is both at the national level as well as on an international level. Pasi Sahlberg, who's a Finnish scholar, talks about this as a cultural paradox because we're trying to raise standards by drawing lessons from other countries which have very different contexts a lot of the time. So globalization, he says, is a cultural paradox because it both unifies and diversifies people and culture. It unifies national education policies by integrating them in a broader global trend, but because of the problems and challenges are similar from one education to another, the assumption is then that solutions and education reform agendas can be similar and are becoming similar, but actually and certainly Sahlberg is quite critical of this. Education experts and policymakers do try to address educational challenges in their context, and they do are informed by international comparisons in the aim of trying to see how to address this and what lessons to learn. And probably the most or the example with the most impact is PISA, the Programme of International Student Assessment, which is a high-stakes assessment, not in the traditional sense that it has the 15-year-old who sits the PISA test, that has a high impact on how they go, whether they get to uni or not. But it's actually a high-stakes test in respect to politicians and policymakers. And Theo Egan and Gordon Stobart made quite an interesting comment about this in a fairly recent issue, which was specifically looking at high-stakes testing, where they observed that current international assessments is kind of a new high-stakes phenomenon in respect to that. When we look at high-stakes assessments, and in fact when we look at all these standardised and nationwide type of assessments, it's just a myriad of acronyms, so I'm just going to go through them fairly quickly. Some of these I'm going to talk about, some of these I'm not. I will talk about the OECD, which is the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and that's the organisation behind the PISA test, Programme for International Student Assessment, which is, and I will talk about this shortly. It's a test that runs every 3 years for 15-year-olds. There's another example, which is the TIMSS, looking at maths. Again, that's in high school and it runs every so many years, not organised by the OECD. PIRLS is a primary reading literacy study. That's every 4 years, I think. Every year we have the NAPLAN, which is the National Assessment Programme in Literacy and Numeracy. We've got also the National Assessment Programme in Civics and Citizenship, which doesn't at all attract as much attention. Another acronym here is the Index of Community and Socio-Educational Advantage, which informs the My School website, which publishes the NAPLAN data in a public forum. Okay, I'm going to talk about that later. So the OECD then, every 3 years, as I said, there's a study. that's comparing national educational outcomes published by the OECD, and every time the data is published, it has a huge response, shall we say, by press internationally. And quite often you get the headlines and the scary canary take on things. Lately, or in the last few years, the Asian nations, particularly Shanghai, South Korea, and in Singapore, have done really, really well. So they've been on the trend upwards, whereas a lot of the kind of nations like Australia and economies that have been developed for a lot longer are actually slipping. So that's where the whole "are we falling behind" rhetoric comes in. In the piece, I should also point out actually that it's not just the student achievement, it's also looking at how equitable education is in the different cultures and countries. So it's looking at inclusivity, it's looking at kind of resources that are being rolled out, it's looking at the difference between the high achievers and the low achievers within the nation. So there's a whole lot of different metrics involved in this. What drives the whole testing program is what is important for citizens to know and be able to do. So it's not looking at rote learning at all, which a lot of people think that it is, but it's not actually. It's looking at problem solving and looking at the application and the extrapolation of information that students are able to do and then apply into unfamiliar settings, both inside and outside of school. Not every 15-year-old is doing it. It's not every school that does it. It's a sample that's supposed to represent the nation as a whole. And again, the reason, remember, who actually rolls this out? Well, it's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So the whole idea is really to get an understanding of human capital in a nation. Okay, how capable are the people, knowledge economy, etc., in that nation, and how competitive are we? So that's where the whole idea of a globalized context is quite prominent. Some information from the last OECD report in respect to PISA. Australia was ranked 19th out of 65 participating nations. Incidentally, that's constantly increasing as well. There weren't that many nations to begin with, but then that's had a lot of traction, so more and more people get involved in this. And there's been a slight decline from the previous test. The result in Australia was quite compatible with Vietnam, Austria, Ireland, Slovenia, Denmark, New Zealand and the Czech Republic, which obviously are nations that are quite different culturally. Well, not necessarily New Zealand, but some of those other nations are quite different from Australia. So again, that raises the issue, well, are we really competitive and comparative if we look at what Sahlberg is talking about? Some of those nations where Australia is quite close in respect to the UK, United States and Canada, you've got some comparisons there as well. And as I said, some of the Asian nations, particularly Shanghai, China, Singapore, South Korea and Hong Kong are the top countries. Finland's also quite high ranking, or has been for quite a long time. Okay, so there have been some global shifts in respect to accountability measures and the idea of how well are teachers doing their job, and that's then informed by standardized assessments. In England, there's quite a long tradition of both school inspections and league tables that have informed the policies and the practice. And quite interestingly, Hargreaves and Shirley talk about various generations of how policy and practice has developed and how it's changing and shifting and being repositioned. So I'm just going to share that with you shortly. They talk about the 4 ways, with the first way being state support and professional freedom, which produced innovation and new social movements. So it wasn't so much a tracking, it certainly wasn't accountability. kind of from above, but that resulted in quite uneven school performances, very inconsistent leadership and educational reforms, informed really by intuition and ideology rather than evidence. From that first wave, the second wave, which had a focus on prescription, so quite a strong curriculum. This is what you need to do at this particular year level, element of competition between schools. It's really, the second wave is one of standardization, uniformity and inequity as well, which led to great costs in teacher motivation, leadership capacity and student learning. So kind of a dark age in trying to shape up and again improve schools and move forward, if you like. The third way, which is essentially where we probably find ourselves now, there's an attempt to balance a professional community with accountability, but largely it's been quite preoccupied with collecting, analysing and tracking students rather than necessarily making sure that really informs practice. In fact, there's an old saying, weighing the pig won't fatten it. Well, it's the same thing, just measuring students won't improve their learning unless we act on that information. So it's often driven by quite short-term solutions because there need to be quick fixes, and that's the whole idea again of accountability and trying to implement these changes and lift performance. And in the fourth way, more humanistic partnerships between teachers and the profession and the government based on democracy and professionalism really is the hallmark of it. And that's also where we find the idea of intelligent accountability that Honora O'Neill, which is one of your readings for this week, fits. And indeed Hopkins is talking, and Assis Sahlberg as well. So it's kind of the next shift, and that's largely where scholars kind of say, look, there needs to be another way of going about it. And that again fits in with the idea of weighing and fattening the pigs. That's kind of the fattening the pig aspect, where it's not just the measuring, it's really having a bit of trust as well in between, but still making learning outcomes explicit and people in charge and making sure that they do a good job. So when we're looking at intelligent accountability, there's an introduction to external accountability policy that is presumed to have a positive impact and a sustained impact on student achievement scores, but quite a lot of research suggests that that's not necessarily the case. It's not a panacea, as Hopkins says. So systems and schools actually need to shift from external accountability to a framework that has much stronger internal accountability in respect to measurable, or maybe not necessarily measurable, but certainly evidence-based outcomes that show that that progression is happening, that learning is happening, and that people are doing their job. I'm just going to pause this for a moment. Yes? Oh, sure. No worries. That's okay. Thank you. So this balanced framework, as I said, is intelligent accountability. If you have the time, I would encourage you to have a look at some of the standard testing in America. You can click on those links. I'm not actually going to talk about it all that much. Linda Darling Linda Darling, what's her name? Anyway, right. I'm not going to talk all that much about standardized testing in America, but it certainly has been a big thing there as well. You can look at these video clips in your own time, but it's a similar idea with standardized testing being rolled out. And in fact, there are some similarities between the different states, which have got different curriculum and different ways of testing compared to Australia, which obviously had state curriculum systems and then shifted into a national curriculum. So there's some differences there that you might want to explore in your own time, but I'm not going to talk about it all that much right now. Looking instead at the Australian context with national testing in the My School website, the National Assessment Programme, or the NAP, originated from the Adelaide Declaration and then was further strengthened in the Melbourne Declaration, and from there it was rolled out. So it actually replaced a lot of the statewide testing and benchmarking that was going on before that and became a national test. Some people see this as a prime example of the audit culture we find ourselves in. Hardy and Boyle are two of those people who argue for this. And the media response has been to kind of publish league tables of the best and worst schools, and that's where the My School website fits in, where teachers and schools have been positioned as a subject to public accountability for classroom achievements, regardless of the contextual information surrounding the students. Having said that, there is an argument that we're comparing like schools with like schools through the ICSIA scores, which is an indication of the parents' level of education and also the wealth, if you like, of the suburb, etc., etc. Because as we know, the home has a huge impact on educational achievement. If you look at Hattie's work, that's actually the strongest influence on educational achievement. So given that it's prominent, the My School website, where those national testing results are published, argue that they're being addressed. You make up your own mind. So in 2008, the National Assessment Programme was rolled out. It meant that for the first time, all the students in years 3, 5 and 7 and 9 across Australia sat the same test at the same time, which was 1 week in May, coming up shortly, as you know. And the different states and territory benchmark tests had previously been used to provide a snapshot of students' learning was then replaced by one single test. When I say one single test, it's actually 5 tests, but it's within the NAPLAN umbrella, if you like. The Education Minister at the time for the Labor government, Julia Gillard, stated when the national assessment was introduced that it, for the first time, would provide a truly accurate picture of how our kids are progressing. Their national results, combined with the development of a national curriculum, provide an opportunity for collaborative reform which genuinely raises standards. So you're back again to that first slide from Gordon Stobart and what he was saying. The rationale for the NAPLAN testing is given as Australia's future depends on each citizen having the knowledge, understanding, skills and values necessary to provide the basis for a productive and rewarding life for citizens in an educated, just and open society. Sounds very similar, I think, to what we see in the OECD. High quality schooling is central to achieving this vision, and then the idea is that you measure it so that we know how we go about it. The focus on national testing has become kind of a taken for granted practice within schools, and teachers are quite disposed to engage with the testing process as part of their daily work. Some people question the focus upon NAPLAN, its value and how it influences education using, or kind of questioning why we're really doing that. Teachers consider NAPLAN, and this is from a study again, which is one of your readings by Ian Hardy. Teachers are considered NAPLAN as just one form of data. It is useful to focus attention upon students' needs, but it's not deemed to be adequately catered for, or haven't been adequately catered for previously. However, there's a problem in that the NAPLAN data, the results from the students' assessment is not actually available to teachers for quite a long time. It used to be a case that teachers could mark it themselves, so to inform their learning, so to kind of use the formative aspect, meaning that they could address those gaps until the formal results were rolled out once the data had been analysed. But that is no longer possible, and in fact, I think it's this year, the tests are becoming conducted on computers. But I'm not sure that necessarily the feedback is going to, or the results are going to come back all that much quicker, because even before, all except for the writing test, all those tests were shared the bubble test, so marked by computers rather than by humans, if you like. So it was still quite a big lag in disseminating all that data and then eventually having it sent out to schools and then published on the My School website. So that's actually something for you to consider, whether this computerized version will help speed up feedback or not. Hardy also talks about the complex ensemble of practices which reflect the myriad of influences that are all at play at the same time, which means that it's quite a complex situation with NAPLAN and how it's used and how it's perceived, how it informs teachers' practice. I strongly encourage you to read that paper because it's actually a really interesting study, and it's an ongoing research into the nature of teachers' work and learning under the current policy conditions in Queensland. And it did find that it had a strong focus on teachers meeting, discussing, informing one another about NAPLAN, which can be seen as quite a good thing. In fact, some of the data generated from the NAPLAN, actually schools are provided with some fantastic resources to address and help feed learning forward and achieve those, closing the gaps, if you like. He also found that teachers were engaging in curriculum development practices as a foreground for NAPLAN, which can be seen as quite a positive thing. Also, teachers were actively preparing students to sit the test, including whether this was intentional or not intentional teaching to the test. That's often seen as something really detrimental, but on the other hand, if we keep in mind that, okay, NAPLAN is supposed to be, assess students' ability to read and write. Well, presumably that is something that teachers actually need to do. But whether it's teaching test taking per se, when I was teaching Year 5, I was teaching Year 5 the very year NAPLAN was rolled out, and I found myself very explicitly trying to get my students to read questions and think about the inferred meaning. So you could say that I was teaching to the test, whereas I would argue that I was actually teaching critical thinking and reflection. So I leave that up to you. The strategies which occurred always seemed quite confined within a broader field dominated by concerns about improved outcomes on standardised literacy and numeracy tests, and the educational or the educative logics may be at risk due to this overwhelming policy and political attention to standardised assessment. And Ian Hardy found that this might have some quite negative effects on students' learning and teachers' learning. A field of schooling practices increasingly characterised by Hardy as an economy of numbers rather than an economy of learning. And there's this whole idea of enumeration, the test results, and how to improve those results being very much the focus. So there's some interesting pictures, and there's quite a lot of good quotes in there as well from this study, which is from teachers and what they're thinking. My school indicators are not actually a measure of the quality of a school. As I said, the My School website is where the data from the NAPLAN is published. And there's some flaws in these systems, which is quite widely pointed out by scholars as well. This isn't necessarily a scholarly article, but if we look at Bonner and Cato, argue that data fails to reflect the home background of the influencers, and as I said, that's something that Hattie is talking about as well, and that's not provided consistently from one school to the next, so therefore that has the problem. There's a problem then with the ICSEA data, and it's not a measure of engagement in learning or quality of teachers, they argue. I am encouraging you to have a look at this video clip on the My School website. In fact, it might be a good idea to pause this video right now, click on the link and then explore it. Note the highly sophisticated use of data, consider who the intended audiences are and what that data or what all those colour-coded segments actually tell you. Have also think about the fact that educators and researchers have some quite grave concerns about the My School website. The collection of data nevertheless, this collection of data has actually enabled researchers to analyse trends regarding equity, Indigenous, gender, rurality, and sector, and how that impacts independent school, Catholic school, etc. How that compares. It's also quite an interesting resource if you're applying for a job, for example. It gives you really good information about a school and understand where that fits in. So it's not all bad, but we need to be critical. Bonner has also talked about the funding and the equity aspect in relation to ICSEA scores, and I encourage you to have a bit of a look at those links as well. So what is then the impact of testing and teachers in the school? Well, the publication of NAPLAN results and the MySchool data have brought very mixed reactions from schools and teachers. You can see they're both positive and negatives. There is increased knowledge about how to teach genres of writing and concepts, as well as lots of resources being made available, some are fantastic. And I'm not talking about the dodgy supermarket ones you see, I'm talking about resources that are rolled out for schools. There's also an increased degree to which schools teach to the test, which we can look at. On the positive side, there's some really meaty and fine-grained data in respect to each question and task, which really actually gives schools a fantastic detailed information about the students' skills, and they can see patterns if there are certain aspects that the school really isn't doing very well. Well, that's obviously something that they can work on and as a cohort with the teachers. On the negative side, it has taken up a lot of time in respect to both analysing results and then thinking how we're going to address that. It has allowed teachers to see the test as one element in a range of assessments, but there is an element of judgment in there, which some people feel quite anxious about. All students are expected to sit the test regardless of ability, and that has exposed teachers and schools to accusations of cheating when not all students participate. And yeah, there's more curriculum time provided for literacy and numeracy, which means narrowing of the curriculum, if you like, because other subjects won't have as much time. And certainly a number of groups, unions and other parent organisations challenge the need for testing, which adds to the complexity. From a parent's point of view, I shouldn't say that because I'm not a parent, but one of the things that have come out is that there are some concerns that as a result, the Australian Federation Government's MySchool website was justified in terms of making the standards of education in each school transparent, especially for parents choosing the right to, if they've got the right school for their child. So there's a lot of scouting about. Testing and ranking of schools had tended to increase anxiety and uncertainty from parents rather than the intended purpose for providing information. If you look at articles, a lot of the time it's pointed out the very common sense that if you really want to know about a school, go and visit it. Don't just look at it on the MySchool website. But it is a source of information as well. So the topic for this week has covered some complex issues. Keep in mind that national aspirations for future success are tied to education. This drives political urgency around standards and the nature of schools, and the international focus on testing and ranking drives national practices. Pros and cons for testing regimes, and the policies related to education and testing are dynamic, and they tend to shift to a more learner-centred or teacher quality aspect. You can look at the different spectrums, if you like. And that's it. You've got a whole host of references there. I encourage you to read the readings I've put up. There's some really interesting articles in there as well. Thank you very much.